Today on Face the Nation, the week that was in American politics. We'll talk to Republican John McCain, Democrat Dick Durbin, congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes, and chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford about the blowback from the Massachusetts Senate race, the Supreme Court ruling that could turn politics on its head, and the sudden opposition to the confirmation of Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke.
Face the Nation with CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
And good morning again. Senator Durbin is in Springfield, Illinois. This morning, Senator McCain is with us in the studio, and we're going to begin here. Senator McCain, just in case there were not enough news for us to deal with, now an audio tape of Osama bin Laden has popped up overnight claiming responsibility for the Christmas bomber and promising more such attacks. You were very critical last week of how this whole Christmas bomber deal has been handled by the government. Are you satisfied that the government is doing enough on this?
Well, I think that the events of last week and the way it was handled proved that there were significant errors made, both in anticipating the Christmas bomber and putting together all the information that was obviously there. But the Osama bin Laden tape, I'm sure indicates that Osama bin Laden is still a motivating force for jihadist Islamic extremists throughout the world. And so we have to stay after him. But any chance of finding out Osama bin Laden's connection with this bombing vanished when the decision was made without consulting any of our intelligence heads by apparently the Justice Department with directions to low level of the FBI to give this individual a trial in civil court, which then gave him his Miranda rights, and he was lawyered up. He was cooperating until he got a lawyer. Now that makes it almost impossible for us to pursue the leads that the Christmas bomber might have. That, to me, is unbelievable.
As yet, the government has reviewed this, but we haven't seen anyone who's been held accountable yet.
No one has been held responsible. Apparently, it may be, unfortunately, the old Washington game, not invented with this administration. We're all responsible, so no one is responsible. The American people expect us to hold people accountable, and I intend, as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, to see if we can't continue to find out who was responsible and hold them accountable.
Should they be dismissed, fired? Should heads roll here?
I think that, as the president said, there's responsibility. There was a failure, and as soon as we find out the depth of those failures, obviously I think there should be changes made. Otherwise, we really are not addressing the personnel side of it. The other side of it is we ought to look at what we've done with the reorganization of government and the creation of massive new bureaucracies, and whether we've actually improved our ability to stop these attacks from taking place.
Do you think creating the Department of Homeland Security on reflection was a good idea, or was it just another level of bureaucracy?
I think the 9/11 Commission clearly concluded, and I agreed with them, that there had to be a consolidation of intelligence assets and greater cooperation and sharing amongst the various agencies. Now, whether the creation of that department has achieved that goal or not is, in light of recent events, is not absolutely clear.
Senator, a lot of unforeseen opposition suddenly cropped up last week to the confirmation of Ben Bernanke to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I now count some 10 senators, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, who say they're going to vote against him. Are you going to vote for him or against him?
I'm very skeptical about his nomination. I'm worried that if his nomination is turned down, the effect that it might have. But the fact is that Chairman Bernanke was in charge when we hit the iceberg, and his policies were partially responsible for the meltdown that we experienced. I think that he should be held accountable.
Well, do you think he should withdraw his nomination?
No, I don't know, because again,
well, I mean, are you going to vote against him, or you're just concerned about it?
I'm both concerned and leaning against.
leaning against voting for him. Let's talk about this Supreme Court ruling this week, which really blew the lid off putting limits on money in politics. You've been a leader in trying to limit the impact of money in politics. Now we're seeing a Supreme Court ruling that says corporations can just go right in there. If somebody comes out, for example, against Wall Street bonuses, a corporation can say, buddy, you're doing it at your own risk because we want to buy some attack ads and run them against you. What do you plan? Do you plan to do anything in response to this?
I don't think there's much that can be done, to tell you the truth, Bob. I was not surprised at the Supreme Court decision. I went over to observe the oral arguments. It was clear that Justice Roberts, Alito, and Scalia, by their very skeptical and even sarcastic comments, were very much opposed to BICRA. I think that it was interesting that they have had no experience in the political arena. I was reminded of the story of Lyndon Johnson when he was vice president, was told about President Kennedy's appointments of all these brilliant people, and he said, you know, I wish one of them had run for county sheriff. We're going to see now a inundation of special interest money into political campaigns. I think that diminishes the influence of average citizens. And by the way, I would point out that both Justice Rehnquist and Justice O'Connor, who had taken a different position on this issue, both had significant political experience. Justices Roberts, Alito, and Scalia have none, but it is what it is.
So you're not intending to try to introduce any legislation. You just don't think it's possible now.
The Supreme Court has spoken on an issue of on a constitutional basis.
But reform is dead.
Oh, I think so. I think that there's going to be, over time, a backlash, because when you see the amounts of union and corporate money that's going to go into political campaigns, but in the short term, the Supreme Court has spoken. I respect their decision.
Well, we had this thunderbolt in Massachusetts where a Republican gets elected to Ted Kennedy's seat. I think it's fair to say that it has stalled the drive toward health care reform in the Senate. The Democrats no longer, for one thing, have enough votes to filibuster health care. Where do you think this ought to go now? What should Republicans do in response to this?
Do what we've done and say we'd be willing to sit down and start over from the beginning. With genuine negotiations, there are things we can agree on, whether it be medical malpractice reform or whether it be across state lines, people can purchase insurance policies that suits them best, outcome-based treatment, even to refundable tax credits for people to be able to purchase health insurance on their own. There are many things we could do. But we also have to reject this process. People in my state are as angry about the process of bribery and extortion. The Louisiana Purchase, the Cornhusker kickback, all of these unsavory deals that were made behind closed doors. This is a president who promised to have it on C-SPAN, and now they did all these deals that are at the expense of other states.
Do you think you could get other Republicans to sit down at a table with Democrats and say, look, let's just go over what we can agree on here and then go out and pass that and let that be a starter?
As long as we start from the beginning. But we categorically reject much of what the Democrats have passed on a party line vote continuously.
I want to ask you one other question about Guantanamo. You and the president agreed it ought to be closed. The deadline he set for closing it came and went last week. What do you do now? Should it still be closed?
Yes, but you have to have developed a policy to address the issues, particularly the enemy combatants who must be kept and can't be released, and what you do with them. In other words, the president's mistake was announcing the closure within a year without having all the policies in place to achieve that. So Guantanamo Bay must remain open until such time as we have a coherent, comprehensive policy addressing the detainees, and many of them cannot be released, especially to some of the countries that they've been released to and they've gone back into the fight.
John McCain, thank you so much.
Thank
we
you,
asked
Bob.
for some news this morning. I think you brought us some.
Thank
I
you.
want to go now to Dick Durbin, who's number 2 in the Democratic leadership in the Senate. He's in Springfield, as we said a while ago. Let's pick up on that health care, those remarks by Senator McCain on health care. Senator Durbin, what are Democrats going to do now?
Well, we are now considering our strategy. We have talked to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, about an avenue that we can follow. But for those who say, start over, let's start at the beginning. Let's do a little bit. Let's maybe do nothing, some say. I would just tell them, if we do nothing, the Medicare Trust Fund will be exhausted in 7 years. The plan we have before the Senate would extend the life of Medicare for 9 more years. If we do nothing, there'll be 57 million Americans uninsured instead of 47 million in just a few years.
Well,
and the cost of the average health insurance plan for the average family of 4 will double in the next 10 years if we do nothing.
Well,
that's why we think this is a serious issue.
Well, I don't think anybody would argue that it is not a serious issue, Senator Durbin. But let me just ask you this: what Senator McCain said. He said he is willing to try to get some Republicans to sit down with Democrats and see what you agree on. What would be wrong with that? Just saying, here's what's out there. We agree with this. We don't agree with that, and then just go past what you agree on. Wouldn't that be a start?
There's nothing wrong with it. But Bob, for the record, President Obama met personally with the Republican leaders in the House and Senate before this began and engaged them and asked them, be part of it. We brought them into the committee hearings. 170 Republican amendments were accepted as part of this process in both the Senate committees. We have kept the door open. We waited for months in the hopes of bringing across 3 Republican senators who expressed an early interest. So to suggest that we have closed the door to them and haven't engaged them is really not a proper statement of what's happened.
Well, clearly you're not going to get it done by the President's State of the Union speech next week, which was the original goal. When would you expect, Senator, that Democrats will be ready to bring something to the floor?
I'm not going to give you a deadline. I've seen too many of those.
Well, I mean, do you think weeks,
and
a month?
failed.
Some people say if you wait 6 weeks, like some are suggesting, you might as well just kiss the whole thing goodbye. But you...
Well, I think what we have to do is honestly sit down with our membership and decide the best course of action to move forward. The door is always open on the Republican side. We're still reaching out to try to find those who will support this. But we have to accept the obvious. This problem that we face with health care in America is one of the greatest threats to the future of our economy, not just as a nation, but as businesses and families. If we ignore this and walk away from it for whatever reason, we are going to face a crisis much, much worse in the near future. The president understands that. We would not even be in this position of taking this seriously if he hadn't shown the courage to lead us into this debate.
Let me ask you about Ben Bernanke. Do you have the votes to get him confirmed, Senator? I know you're one of the vote counters.
Well, I'm going to vote for Chairman Bernanke. I have some misgivings about Fed policy and economic policy, but I really do have to say this man guided us through the worst economic crisis this nation has seen since the Great Depression, and we are in much better shape today because of his guidance and leadership. I still have unanswered questions, and many colleagues do. We will need Republican support to make certain that we pass the cloture vote, which is a 60-vote requirement when it's taken up this next week. I think that we're going to have the votes to make sure that he is reconfirmed as chairman of the Federal Reserve.
You think, but you're not sure at this point.
Well, any whip who gives you that kind of prediction this far in advance hasn't been on the job very long, and I've been there for a while.
Senator, why do you think Scott Brown won the race in Massachusetts?
Variety of reasons. Some went right to the candidates and the campaigns, others to much larger issues. I think the independent voters in particular in Massachusetts told us, focus on the economy, focus on creating jobs. Let's see more action and more commitment in Washington than we have. I accept that verdict of history and that message. Secondly, they are frustrated by the fact that we haven't passed health care reform. Remember, Massachusetts is a state which under a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, with the support of then State Senator Scott Brown, put a mandate in for health insurance. 97 to 98% of the people in Massachusetts have health insurance. Some of them were concerned that our health care reform would diminish their state benefits. So it was a complex issue within the state of Massachusetts. But I think more than anything, the voters there said, get busy in Washington, do something about the economy.
And campaign finance. You just heard Senator McCain say that this ruling by the Supreme Court pretty much blows the lid off reform. He sees nothing that can really be done from here on in.
I joined with John McCain and Russ Feingold in supporting their campaign finance reform. It was good law, and I'm glad we did it. But banning soft money from campaigns was small in comparison to what the Supreme Court did to America this last week. I can't wait to see my Republican and conservative friends who stood up and preached against judicial activism explain this decision, which overturned 60 to 100 years of American precedent. A precedent which basically said we want to keep big business out of our campaigns in America. And now, in the name of giving free speech, this Supreme Court has allowed political extortion by big business, big oil, big banks. Think about this for a minute, Bob. We're considering a tax on the multi-million-dollar bonuses of the executives at banks who receive bailout money. Those banks can now come and say to senators and congressmen, incidentally, we want you to vote against this tax, and we're going to be big players in the next election. We're going to spend millions of dollars and reward our friends and punish our enemies. That's exactly what this Supreme Court has invited. Now, what can we do? We can demand disclosure. We can demand that those who belong to labor unions and shareholders vote before the money is spent on any political campaigns. And even more important, I'd say to John McCain, join me in a public financing effort. I've got the bill in with John Larson of Connecticut. Let's really take the reform on that many states already have started, including the state of Arizona, to make sure that every candidate of modest means has a chance to run and win.
All right. Dick Durbin of Illinois. Thank you so much, Senator. Hope to see you again.
Thanks, Bob.
Back in a minute. And to talk about all of what we just heard and the events of last week, congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes, our chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. Nancy, the campaign reform decision that came down from the court and this blowback from this election in Massachusetts, it hit Capitol Hill like a thunderbolt.
It sure did, and it is a great thing for Republicans because they were having a really tough time raising money before this ruling came down. A lot of corporations were feeling a bit nervous about donating to Republicans and going against the majority party in the fall. Now that Scott Brown has won, these companies see, oh, Republicans actually do have a better shot in the fall, and now they have unlimited resources they can spend on defeating them.
Scott Brown came to Capitol Hill. You interviewed him out in the corridor. He was greeted like a rock star.
He really was. He's definitely the new Republican superstar. Watch out, Sarah Palin. But it's very interesting. He is, in many ways, a true Republican moderate, New England moderate. He's pro-abortion rights. He thinks that all Americans should get health care coverage. And so if he stays down the middle in the Senate, and as you know, moderates are a real dying breed there, it's possible that he could make being a moderate cool again in the Senate, and you might start to see more cooperation between the parties than we have all year.
Well, I saw one conservative commentator this week, Jan, saying, well, we're sure glad to have him in the Senate, but we're going to have to watch him on those Supreme Court nominations when they come up. Jan, what do you think the impact of this ruling on campaign finance is going to be?
You know, I think it's too soon to really say what the fallout, from this bomb is going to be. But remember, it's not just corporations that can kind of play ball now. It's unions and outside groups. It's the Sierra Club, the National Rifle Association. So, corporations kind of tend to be leery about getting involved in the process. They've got shareholders to answer to. They've got a public that they kind of want to look good in front of. So we may now see, I think in the short term, the rise of some of these outside groups that are already established. Like I said, the Sierra Club, Americans for Responsible Health Care, the National Rifle Association, taking a lot of that money and funneling it into the process while the corporations may kind of stand back and wait a while, let some of those outside groups do it.
We were all waiting for this decision. Were you surprised that the court issued a decision that was as broad as it was?
No, not at all. Like Senator McCain said, we sat through that argument. You could see the skepticism from the justices. Remember, though, this is not just that we have a new Supreme Court. Moderate Anthony Kennedy wrote this decision, and the government took the extraordinary position during the argument that this law allows the government to ban political books that are, funded by these outside groups up to, the election day. The justices really took issue with that. And I've got to say, just listening kind of to some of this debate and hearing what Senator Durbin said, kind of about how now the court has just authorized political extortion. I mean, that is really, I think the public's going to find that to be a real stretch, because you've got a Senate, that's really selling votes in a Senate chamber to authorize health care reform. You've got a Gallup poll showing that 9% last year of Americans think that Congress is an honest and ethical job. And now you've got senators saying this paves the way for extortion. If you're saying that, I mean, that reminds me of what, Winston Churchill said. We've already established what you are. Now we're just haggling over the price.
What about this Bernanke? Is he going to be confirmed, Nancy?
Well, it's a great question. After this seismic election in Massachusetts, there are a lot of Democrats who are feeling very vulnerable and feeling like they need to take a tough stand on the economy. This would be a very easy way for them to do it, is to go ahead and vote against him. Right now, you've got a small handful of Democrats who are saying they're going to vote against him, a small handful of Republicans. You heard Senator McCain say he's leaning against it. If it stays a handful, he'll be fine. If this snowballs, he could be in trouble. It would be the first time that a president could not get his nomination for Fed Chair passed.
What do you think the impact, Jan, of Scott Brown's election was?
Well, I think if you looked at the polls, and the Washington Post had a really fascinating poll this weekend, 75% of Scott Brown's voters say they sent him to Washington to work with Democrats and get Republican ideas into legislation. So there's a lesson for Republicans here too. We don't want obstruction. We want to see things get done. And if you look at those polls, the people who voted who voted for Scott Brown say health care was the number one reason, but not because of the substance. It was because of the backdoor dealings and the lack of bipartisanship. The second reason they gave was because of the way things in Washington aren't working. That's a huge lesson to be learned there. There's a big lesson for President Obama. Get out of the campaign mode, start governing. We don't want to see the confetti falling down right now. We want people to get to work together.
I'm going to say a little something about that in just a minute, my final thoughts. We'll be back with that in just a second. Finally today, figuring out what Scott Brown's victory meant has set off a fiercer debate than trying to divine the meaning of the book of Job. We were all certain it meant something profound, we just weren't sure what. Well, a Washington Post poll yesterday provided some clues. 63% of Massachusetts voters thought the country had gone off course, and the big part of them voted for Brown. That's pretty simple, actually. But here's the interesting part. 3/4 of those voters, Massachusetts voters, mind you, said they wanted Brown to work with Democrats to get Republican ideas into legislation. Let me say that again. 3/4 of his voters said they wanted him to work with the other side. My own take is the vote for Brown was not so much a vote for or against policy or party as it was a vote against the process itself. People don't like the political games, and they've lost confidence in a bumbling bureaucracy that since Katrina can't seem to get out of its own way. Why trust the government with a complicated health care proposal when it can't catch a terrorist whose own father tried to turn him in? It will take the perseverance of Job and a lot of political courage, but if the two sides could somehow pay less attention to the voices on the fringes of the left and the right, take the Massachusetts voters' advice, sit down together and see what they can agree on, who knows? They might get something done. They couldn't do worse. They might even like it. And I don't need a poll to tell me the rest of us surely would. Back in a minute. And thanks for watching Face the Nation. We'll be right here next week. See you then.
This broadcast was produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guests and topics. It originated in Washington, D.C.